I just arrived in Hyderabad yesterday. I'm very excited to be here, very excited to see all of you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about structuring a game studio and also the culture that forms around that. But I wanted to start with a story that goes back earlier in my career where I had only worked at one game company. And that game company was Activision at the time. This was the mid 1990s. It was a much smaller company than it is today. So much smaller. This sounds hard to believe, but when I started at Activision, there were only two people at the whole company who had ever shipped a game. That sounds great, but it's the truth. That's how much smaller Activision was back in the mid 1990s. And so everybody was kind of trying to figure out, how do you do this? How do you make a game? How do you even structure a team to make a game? And there was just a lack of experience around this. And later in my career, right after Activision, I had a chance to go spend a little bit of time as a contractor working on site at Electronic Arts. And at that point in time, EA was like one in every 4 games sold was an Electronic Arts game. And so in my head, I'm thinking, this is so great. I'm finally going to get to see the right way to make games and the right way to structure a game team. And of course, I got there and I found out that they didn't know what they were doing either. They were still making it up at that point in time. And I think as the years have progressed, and obviously now we're 30 years later, there have been some schools of thought on approaches that are a little more methodical for structuring a game team. And so I guess I want to start off by saying I don't think there's one right answer. I still don't feel like I know the right way to do things, but I'm going to share some of what I've observed at some of the different companies I've worked, and also over the different stages of development and growth of those companies. So the big question we're talking about then is, what is the ideal structure for a game team, and does it change with scale? Let's see if I can get to the next slide. There it goes. Okay, so there are 3 big buckets of structure that I'm going to talk about, and we'll look at some diagrams to illustrate what these look like. But first, just want to talk about what they are. And the first one, simplest in concept, is just that there is a flat organization that reports up to somebody who is a founder or a GM or a game director, or whatever their title is, that there is a flat organization that reports up to someone. It makes sense that a small team might start this way because typically in a small team, people are equals and it doesn't require a whole lot of organization to enable that team to functionally be effective. But there have been some very large teams that have adopted structures that are meant to be effectively flat. I've never worked at Valve, but I think Valve is a company that is famous for trying to stay flat. There was a period at Riot where apparently Riot also tried to adopt a structure that was flat. I'll say I love this structure. I think many of the teams that spun out from big companies like Riot, like Blizzard, started out by going back to a flat structure because all of the organizational overhead and all of the meetings and all of the middle management roles that get created in a big org chart feel burdensome, feel like they slow down the process. And so I think there's a lot of nostalgia among developers who work at big publishers to go back to a structure like this. Ironically, though, as I've watched all of these teams that have spun out, and Frost Giants is a team like this, people get added because there is always large surface area to a project, and inevitably the teams grow to sizes that become difficult to support in a flat structure. So again, Valve, Riot, I think some others have scaled flat, but it is very difficult to do. So typically, as the team grows, where game teams tend to get to is this discipline-based structure where there are leads, like an art lead, an engineering lead, a design lead, often a production lead, and those disciplines are now buckets of people or departments of people who work together to create the game. And this, in fact, was the structure that very early, back in the beginning of my career, when I mentioned Activision only had 2 people that had ever shipped a game, this was the structure that teams kind of naturally gravitated towards. And those team sizes were anywhere from 10 to 30 people, so they weren't anywhere close to what the teams shipping a Call of Duty, much less like an Assassin's Creed or a Grand Theft Auto would be today. But still, this was the default structure that many game teams went to. Last but not least, in terms of typical structures, and this was kind of the last in the evolution that I experienced, was this idea of creating cross-functional groups. So it's no longer just artists or just engineers or just designers. It's a mix of people who are working together to try to accomplish one particular goal. That might be a feature, it might be something bigger, and this kind of came into popularity with the rise in popularity of Scrum and Agile development, and so it might be a story or even an epic that these cross-functional groups get organized around. Interestingly, when I was at Sony working on the God of War project, there was somebody there who had worked in a pod-based structure who really loved it, and they kind of convinced the rest of the team that that was the direction that they want to go. So we restructured from discipline-based to pod-based on that project. And I guess what's interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, every one of these structures has pros and cons. And so it's impossible to say that one of these is the way to make games. In the example of shifting on God of War from discipline-based to pod-based, what happened was the teams working on individual features were very cohesive, but the sense of knowledge sharing and identity for the disciplines across all of the designers or all of the artists broke down. And so we'll talk about some of those communication challenges later, but it was still a win because for that particular team and that particular project, it really helped them focus on delivering value to players. So just to look a little bit, and forgive my weak diagramming skills, at what some of these structures look like visually as you build an org chart. Flat is pretty straightforward. Obviously, there's one layer underneath whoever is running the team, and the individual contributors generally are peers. No one is considered more elevated in the organization than anybody else. It is very egalitarian, which is great. One of the things that I have heard from people who have experienced this structure at scale is that as the team grows and it's no longer possible for that group to just cohesively interact with each other, that something occurs called a gravity well, which is that even though technically everybody on the team is a peer, that someone starts to gain more influence and that creates this attraction of other developers on the team to that person. And suddenly now what looks like a flat structure actually in practice evolves a bit of hierarchy. And it's organic, so it's not necessarily by design, which can be good. I think sometimes individuals who take initiative on a team deserve to have more influence, but it can also create cliques. It can also create team politics. Like clearly, there are a lot of potential downsides to that as well. So I think, pros and cons, but clearly the egalitarian nature of flat is a pro, but a con is the potential for that to degenerate, particularly with scale. Discipline-based, again, there are sort of verticals by discipline. There's generally a leader by discipline that rolls up into game director, production director, somebody who's running the whole project. I think this as a traditional structure can be very effective at creating knowledge sharing and treating departments as a pool of talent that can tackle problems so you can really focus fire on things. But obviously, there is the trade off that when you're working on a large surface area, a big project, the ability for that team to focus fire on smaller, more granular pieces in a way that collaborates with the other departments is very limited. And so, particularly as you get to these huge team sizes that are 100, 200, 300, and up, treating all of the artists and all of the engineers and all of the designers as a single department starts to break down. And it gets very difficult to manage communication in terms of focusing on particular features really starts to degrade. And so that's, again, where the larger scale teams that I have worked on seem to have gravitated more towards this pod based structure where cross discipline, cross functional groups come together to tackle specific aspects of the project. One of the challenges, though, if you're a small team, is how do you have enough people on your team that every single feature that you're working on actually has dedicated staff to work on in these pods. So either you have a big team and you have enough staff that you can allocate that way, or you wind up with people who are in multiple pods at one time. And now all of a sudden they have conflicting priorities. They may have conflicting pod leaders who are experiencing contention over the time that's available for them to do the work. So I think, again, pros and cons to each of these. As we get a little bit further in, I'll talk about how we're approaching this at Frost Giant, but I do want to emphasize, as I started with, I don't think there's one right answer. I think these are all options to be considered as you're thinking about structuring your own project or your own studio. Will make this work. Oh, almost did. Okay. So each of these structures has divisions in different places. Flat, basically, everybody has a division between them, and they've got to figure out how to communicate effectively together. Discipline based, like clearly there are walls between the disciplines that you have to figure out how to bridge, and there's always some contention or tension that happens between the disciplines. Pod based, the walls are between the pods, and so the places that challenge occurs are different, but the challenges still occur. So none of these is without challenge from a communication perspective. It's just where is that challenge? And that can be a conscious choice on you as a person who is architecting a team of where is it most important to optimize the communication? Is it departmental? Is it feature based? And where are the areas that you're willing to absorb more effort to make sure that communication happens effectively? Aha. Uh, One of the techniques that came up to try to mitigate this, to try to deal with the challenge of crossing those divisions and creating effective communication, is this technique of matrixing. And so, matrixing in this context means that although there is one org structure that is the intended org structure for the team, there's another secondary structure that's overlaid on top of it. And so in this case, this is, it could be pod based, it could be discipline based, however you're thinking of dividing these things. But now there's this horizontal idea that individual contributors can also be grouped in another way. So this is a way that you could, for example, take a pod-based structure where people are divided by features and still try to create some sense of cohesion by discipline. So even if their first priority is to be part of this pod structure, there can still be somebody who is responsible for all of the artists, or at a more granular level, maybe it's all of the texture artists, all of the environment artists, but whatever it is, there are still a secondary set of leads, if you want to think of them that way, who are effectively dotted line managers for those people who share whatever it is you've decided that you want to group people by. Um, this structure, again, leads to a little bit more overhead because now you've got more people who have to manage your individual contributors. And also, you've got a team that has to be able to think both in terms of their direct line and also in terms of their dotted line managers. But it does serve to help create cohesion where that cohesion was broken by the structure that you've implemented. And so, again, just like going back and thinking about bigger publishers that I've worked at, something that I started to see happen maybe halfway into the 30 years that I've spent so far, studios started to hire people who had titles like art manager or design manager separate from the lead artist or separate from the lead designer. And these are people who, in this matrixed sense, will overlay their departmental cohesion, even if these other leads are now managing pods that are focused on specific features. And in that way, there's still a sense of a studio like Sony Santa Monica when I was there, or Blizzard when I was there, having an art department, even when that art department doesn't actually get together and do all of their tasking as one unit. Instead, they're getting together with individual pod leaders, and really they're a part of a particular feature or particular aspect of the user interface, or however the pod system has been broken down into. And this really helped solve some of the communication problems that came out of breaking everyone into pods, because people still shared what were the pipeline efficiency improvements that they had discovered, or they still talked about how to improve at their craft as an artist, even though they might be focused on the leaderboard for the next release that's coming up. So anyhow, this idea of matrixing is something that can be powerful. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a form of dotted line management. So it creates a situation where people do have two masters, but there's still generally a clear, like, this is the overriding structure of the team, whether it's pod based or discipline based. There are some other ways that matrixing can apply to a team. Um, Producers are often matrixed with the individual contributors that they work with. Many teams will have a producer per pod, or in a discipline structure, a producer per discipline or sub-discipline. And in that case, people don't actually report to the producer. They still have a pod lead or a craft lead that they report to, but that producer is overseeing the tasking. They may be overseeing the functional and operational organization of the pod or discipline. So in a way, they are matrixed, and you could sort of think of them as a dotted line. I mentioned that people managers. So people managers also try to help address this irony that we have in the business, that as you elevate in your own career, if you're a very talented engineer, let's say, and you reach a point where you get promoted to be a manager of others, that's not necessarily your core competency. The skill set that you need to be a good engineer is completely different from the skill set that you need to be a good manager. And certainly, what I've found as I've gone through my career, and I did start as an engineer, was that a lot of the management stuff is less fun than actually building the game. And so, besides the fact that you're taking people who are the most skilled individual creators and putting them into a role where they no longer create, you are also risking losing them because they don't enjoy this whole new set of responsibilities that's completely different than what they got into the industry to do. So this idea of introducing people managers who help deal with the actual management skill set and cultivating people's careers and all of the things that come with management to free up some of those more talented individual contributors to just focus on doing what they love. And again, this is an area where having people like that, they're kind of matrixed on top of the org structure, but it can be super valuable. And then last but not least is this idea of assistant directors. A lot of the studios that I've worked at have this concept of a director level that might be an art director, a game director, design director, tech director, production director. These are all titles that we see around the industry. Um, those guys are in a management role. They're in a craft management role, but they're in a management role. Again, there's not always a clear path for the people who are working under them to identify who's going to succeed them and also who's going to support them in their role as director. And so this idea of assistant director is kind of a lieutenant to the director level, and they wind up being matrixed on top of the org chart because that group, whether it's a pod or it's a discipline that rolls up into the director, also takes direction from this person. And so they're kind of a dotted line or matrixed on top of. But these are all just examples of how this idea of overlaying another structure, almost a shadow structure, on top of the deliberate organizational structure that you're implementing for the team can help solve some problems, whether it's structural problems, communication problems, even career path problems across the team. So it's a powerful concept. It sounds simple, but I think it's really evolved over time to address some of these nuances of the different structures. And all right, so this is an interesting subject, and from here I'm going to get a little bit into the structure that we've implemented at Frost Giant as well. But I want to talk about this idea of conflict. Every game team that I've worked on, because it's a creative endeavor, people disagree with each other. And I'm sure all of you who work in the industry have experienced this on the teams that you work on. I'll share a story from the project that we're currently working on. Group of developers. These guys, many of them are very senior, but they're very passionate about the right way to do things. And so there was a UI designer and a UI artist debating the best way to implement the foundation for a button in our game. And this discussion became very heated. And in the end, it had to get escalated up to get resolved, and people were red, and it could have been a fist fight. Like, these guys were that passionate about the right way to do the base object for a button. Point being, it is important in architecting a structure for the game team to think about how are you going to resolve conflict on the team. And that conflict doesn't just happen at the individual contributor level. Certainly, directors can butt heads all the way up to the top of the project leadership. And so trying to design a structure that thinks ahead about how to resolve conflict when it happens is probably worth doing. So some of the considerations, okay. I think there are always creative considerations around, we're trying to create an experience for players that brings joy. We're trying to create an experience that would be fun. So there's like the grand creative vision that always has to be balanced with, can we actually do that? Or should we even actually do that? I think from a production perspective, it's always a balance to try to make sure that the creative members of the team are designing things that can realistically be achieved with the team that we've got, the time that we've got, the budget that we've got. And then there's the business consideration of, if we build it, is this even going to be a viable business? And is there product market fit for this game, this feature? Uh, that's an important question. And then finally, is this actually ready for players to experience? Is it at the quality level that we as a team have decided we want to establish as the threshold for what we put out there? All of those are important considerations. And it's not necessarily the case that these have to be different people. You know, you can have one person, two people, three people, four people who are responsible for being the arbiter of these things. But it is important that these all get considered, and it probably makes sense to break these out at least to some extent into checks and balances so that you don't get one person who has some bias towards one of these directions that winds up making a bad decision. And I will certainly say every project, there are so many decisions every day, and I live in constant fear of making the one bad decision that's going to make the project not succeed. And so many projects don't succeed. So I think it is underappreciated how easy it is to step on a mine at any point along a project cycle. And so having some idea of checks and balances to introduce discussion, debate, and of course, conflict resolution when conflict happens, but seems very important to the success of a project. And I'll say some of the most successful teams that I've worked on have not just been harmonious, everybody agrees with everybody. I think often quality comes out of that tension, and that there is a healthy aspect to having creative tension as long as it doesn't get toxic and actual fist fights, you know, don't break out, etc. But anyhow, checks and balances I think is something that is really worth putting thought into as you're architecting a team. And I will go straight from here into, okay, so what did we do at Frost Giant? And let me pause for a second and just talk a little bit about what is Frost Giant and why the heck am I back at a startup. So over the years, I've had a chance to work at a number of big publishers, and I have really appreciated the scope of what it's possible to build at a big publisher and the purity of focus that it's possible to have on just building the game and not having to worry about making payroll and all of the operational stuff that's associated with the company. At the same time, clearly, inside any big publisher, big organization, there's a certain trade off in terms of agency. You are in service to the priorities that get set above you in whatever that broader context of the company is. So startups are appealing uh, for agency specifically, for that ability to go do something that is purely of your own imagination. But it comes with trade-offs, and you know, losing those resources, dealing with all the operational stuff. It really changes the scope of what you can build. I've kind of gone back and forth. I've spent about half my career at big publishers, and I'm really grateful for those experiences. And I can imagine that there could be a world where I work at a big publisher again someday. But I've always been attracted to the agency of working at a startup. And so with Frost Giant, the startup that I'm currently working at, there are a group of us who had worked together on a game at Blizzard. We really enjoyed working together. We really like this particular genre of game. And at the end of that project, there was not an opportunity to build another game like that at Blizzard. So set out to create an independent studio that would enable us to keep working together and keep working on this kind of game that we enjoy so much. But it meant that we had to build a new company from the beginning. And certainly all of those structures that I talked about were things that played into our thinking as we tried to create an architecture for this new company, Frost Giant. But going back to different structures being suitable for different scales, we've gone through all three of those structures at Frost Giant as we've scaled the company. We now heavily employ matrixing to try to address some of those various challenges that we talked about. And I guess last but not least, we've tried to consciously think about how do we set things up to have checks and balances, and how do we deal with conflict resolution. And so I'll point out some of the structural things on this org chart. And I realize it gets very small and you can't read all of the text down at the bottom, but it's really the high level structure that matters that I'm hoping to communicate here. So I have a co-founder. My co-founder is the game director. I try to represent the business and the production concerns. And he tries to represent the creative and also qualitative, like quality concerns, even though the truth is that the QA guys, quality assurance guys, are on my side of the org chart. But ultimately, as game director, he has to be a defender of this lives up to my vision or it falls short of my vision. And so we check and balance each other, and we certainly disagree from time to time. I'm lucky that we have never had a disagreement that required escalating to try to resolve. But you might wonder, in our case, how does a conflict get resolved? Because we're both at the same level and there's two of us. And the answer is, if we ever actually did have a disagreement like that, we have a board. We have a board of directors that's our investors. And so if we needed a tiebreaker, they would break it. Underneath us, you'll see that we are discipline based in terms of who reports to us. So the game director has art, design, audio, and narrative. I've got production, engineering, business, marketing, and also sort of HR or people management under me. But those are indeed matrixed disciplines. The truth is, at this stage in our development, at this size of team, we switched to a pod-based structure. And though that's not reflected here because those pods are very specific to each new build that we build, really the discipline-based is matrixed on top. It's those horizontal lines, and it's the pod-based structure that we're using from milestone to milestone, from sprint to sprint, to deliver the work that we're delivering. We do have leads, and you see that leads layer with individual contributors underneath them. It's really important to us that the people who are making art and who are doing design have somebody who knows their craft at an expert level who is guiding their work. And even though that person, again, is matrixed and is not in their pod, that person is ultimately holding them accountable for delivering to quality. And that goes back to defending what I talked about earlier on in terms of the game director's vision. We also matrix producers, assistant directors, and a people manager. So I don't show that in this org, but we do it. And that has helped us, I think, deal with some of the communication and career path challenges that come out of not having that kind of matrixing. And the last thing I should mention is that our pods reconfigure. So it's not like we just have a UI pod and a VFX pod or something. We actually, on a milestone to milestone basis, think about how should we redistribute the team into small groups to accomplish the features that we want to accomplish for that milestone. We don't use pure Scrum. It's not all user stories, but we do use a lot of ideas that come from Agile, including story points and stand-ups and retros. But org structure, though it can be influenced by methodology, doesn't need to be tied to a specific methodology. So this talk isn't meant to get into waterfall versus Scrum versus Kanban versus other ways of doing it. Much like structures, you probably won't be surprised to hear that I think they all have value, and there's just trade-offs between each of them. So I'll also mention that what I'm showing up here right now was the result of evolution over the course of the company. We've been going for almost 5 years now. When we started out, we were flat. And I'm most nostalgic about that because as a developer, I find that structure the most fun to work in. We went to discipline based as we grew. And then when we finally hit critical mass and we really needed to be as efficient as possible in delivering milestones, we shifted to the pod structure that we have today. So yeah, that's an example of implementing these concepts that we talked about. That's what we've done at Frost Giant, but I wanted to leave a little bit of time to have discussion, take questions. Again, thank you all for coming out today, and I'll just open it up right there. Thank you.
All right, do we have any questions? But if it is a small team and in a top hierarchy, if there is a conflict of interest, but both parties are right, as both follow the best practices, right? What would be the optimal way to solve such issues in a simple manner?
Yeah, I think this is where having some kind of hierarchy, even if it's a flat structure, when we were flat at the beginning of Frost Giant and we had conflicts, ultimately it was that team leader who would be the arbitrator of those. But I think having everybody agree ahead of time on what that hierarchy is going to look like.
Yes, sir, of course, but
helps. Yeah,
my bad.
Go ahead.
But as you said, you have board of directors to decide on top of you, right? But in a small team, we may not have that. So
we should still have a team leader, though.
Yeah,
right. So I think that person should be the arbiter. Would be my suggestion. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Sure. Not sure that was helpful, but sorry.
Thank you for the session, sir. My question is, initially you started in the technical background, as I can see in your LinkedIn, and after that you transitioned into CEO for a studio, right? So how was that transition, and what things you learned in the technical perspective which helped you in your CEO position over there?
Okay.
And one more question.
Yep.
Why did you leave it? Why did you leave the studio? I guess you worked over there 10 years, right?
Why did I leave Blizzard, you mean? Or
No.
which?
After Activision, you started a studio.
Why did I leave Savage? Okay, got it. So, yeah, I guess part one, how did being a developer kind of help me as I became a CEO? And then part two, the last studio I started, why did I leave that one? Okay. I think it's hugely valuable for leaders of development teams to have experienced development themselves. And none of us have the same depth of experience in all of the disciplines as the discipline leads that we're going to have. But I think having lived the implementation problems of being a developer is extremely helpful. That said, being a CEO really has little to do with development, sadly, because development is the thing that got me into making games. But being a CEO, we're trying to keep a team funded, even if we're inside a big publisher. We have to get budget. We're trying to keep a team funded. We've got to hire a team, and we've got to establish high-level vision and culture. But very rarely does a team CEO have time to also be an implementer. There's some that do it, but it is rare because it's not technically part of the job description. But I think just understanding the dynamics of what it takes to build the products and being able to communicate with the team at a level that represents true understanding, I think those are hugely valuable, even though it means that there's a deficit when it comes to things like the business aspect. So I could talk more about that, but I think it was really valuable, and I'm a big believer in people who are developers, who are operators, who become team leaders. The last startup that I started, and it was 1998 when I started that one. It closed in 2010. It was a studio that did development for publishers, sort of advanced against royalty development. And that business model really cratered in the 2008 recession. And so it just became too difficult to continue to get funding for that company. And I'll say it was also very frustrating to only ever be able to work on licensed products for publishers and not to get to build original intellectual property, original games. So thanks for those questions. They were really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Considering upon what you said upon, I wanted to ask, as a startup studio, particularly, what would you emphasize more on? Should the structure be based on the core philosophy you founded upon, or is it the load that goes upon when you expand or have the better opportunities?
What was the second part? The original philosophy versus.
Should you focus on your original philosophy, or as the load goes on, you have to dynamically allocate how things work out? So, what would be the thing you would personally prioritize on this?
Yeah, I think for me, going back to the comment about being at a startup, being motivated by agency, I'll tell a story. So, Supergiant is an independent studio who makes some really great games. And before they launched their first game, they were approached by publishers to do some co-development. And I was at that other startup at that point in time, and they went to lunch and we talked about, like, do they stick to core principle, or here's this business opportunity, should they change their business to go after it? And I went back to agency. Like, they had started this company because they had a very clear idea of something that they wanted to do. And even though it was tempting to chase this other opportunity because there was revenue associated with it, that split focus meant that they would have to compromise their original vision. And it could still work out, but I mean, they made this choice, they took the leap, swing for the fences, and it in this case had a really good result for them. They've made some wonderful games, Hades 2 most recently. So I'm a big believer in core principle, but it is a personal choice. And yeah, a great thought-provoking question.
Hi, Tim. So I had a question. As a venture-backed game studio, which is something that characterizes more and more studios growing globally, can you talk about what the first 12 months were like when you were structuring the business, given that lens and the sort of investor input that came in as well? So maybe how you planned your team structuring and how that led into the product scope and whatnot.
Yeah. Okay. So, kind of, what was different about a venture-backed company? I think I'll start by saying this is my first venture-backed company, so I genuinely am figuring it out as I go along. But it was evident to me at the beginning that being venture-backed, one of the biggest challenges we would face strategically as a company is raising subsequent rounds. So it's rare for a venture-backed company to get all the capital they need up front. Sometimes it happens, but it's rare. In our case, I knew we would need more rounds. So the question I asked myself was, how do we set ourselves up for the greatest likelihood of success on those subsequent rounds? And at that point in time, it sounded like we needed a pretty compelling demo, vertical slice plus in terms of what we showed to get an A round. So I was trying to build towards that in a time frame that was compatible with the amount of capital that we initially raised. And that kind of working backwards dictated who we hired and how we set up the work that we were doing. But again, this is my first time with venture-backed, so I am by no means an expert on that. But thank you for the question.
So my question is that as you scale up, how do you find the right people for the right role? Like, how do you find people for leads and directors? What do you look in them?
Yeah, how do you hire effectively? Building the team is one of the hardest things to do, and I have the good fortune of having spent my whole career in one area. And the results of that over time was establishing a pretty good network. But even though that network provided the initial core for the team, at a certain point, like the network was exhausted and we had to go out. And so we would run ads, we would do all of the things that everybody does to try to drive applications. Really, at the end of the day, most of the successful hires that we got were referrals. So even if it wasn't my network, it was the initial hires that I made, their networks. But one or two of the most successful hires were actually just blind submissions to our website. Our studio engineering director was someone who had worked on the Madden franchise at EA and was just very passionate about the kind of game we were making. So I don't think there's one answer to that question, but I do think heavily if you're able to get those initial strong hires, leveraging their networks and your own network is strong. Certainly, other studios use recruiters and other means to do that. It looks like I'm at time, so up to you guys if we want to take more.
We can take another 1-2 questions.
Okay, very good.
I have a question. So, as a small scale company or a startup, how do you resolve conflicts that are not actually related to work? Because we don't have HRs, we don't have anyone to actually talk about some stuff. So, how do those conflicts get resolved?
Yeah, great question. And one of the hardest parts, I kind of alluded to this earlier, about being at a startup after being at big publishers is we're used to having all of these support departments, marketing departments, legal department, and HR department. And it is difficult to figure out when you're just a group of developers, what do you do to replace all of these other departments? In our case, we have had some conflicts like that, and we've relied on external HR to help us. And also separate from HR, because HR in a lot of people's heads just means kind of legally covering the exposure for the company. We've worked with coaches, so outside HR-like resources who help work with people to level up their ability to avoid conflict and navigate conflict successfully. But I think this happens on every creative team, and I'm always amazed how, at least in America, I don't know how the education system is here, but we don't have any classes on how to successfully interact with other people. We have classes on math and history and all of these other, but nobody actually teaches us how to get along with each other. We're just expected to figure it out, and there are so many senior developers who don't figure it out. So coaches have been a great solution for us.
So on our IGDC channel, we have gotten a comment from Toxic E015 because everybody subscribed to this channel of IGDC. So, sir, there's a question from a YouTube subscriber. The question is, what could be the best way to start working on a startup and a project if we are broke students?
Okay.
The point is this that when we are starting a startup, I'm a startup founder myself, and what happens is when you're starting out, you have to create an MVP. You don't have money to back yourself. So, what's the practical advice to get investors or just create your first game or first project?
Yeah, great question.
Thank you, sir.
So there are so many students who are learning various aspects of game development who don't have a great outlet to have access to capital, to be able to bootstrap their own team. I've seen a number of different student groups form either formal clubs that facilitate students who don't know each other coming together at schools to collaborate on projects, or informal, like just bringing their friends in, dedicating a certain amount of time every week to build projects. And there are so many great platforms now, whether it's simple platforms like Scratch, obviously there's UEFN, there are easy access now with Blender to even use full game engines, whether that's Unity or Unreal. But I think student teams are able to build independent projects in their spare time that could have some commercial success, but at the very least show their capabilities and become a showcase for them to get jobs in the industry later on. It's definitely challenging. It definitely takes a lot of commitment, but I've seen student groups successfully pull that off. So yeah, super happy that so many people are interested in joining the industry. Hope it keeps us all flourishing for many years to come. But awesome. Well, thank you all again for coming out.